Good afternoon. My name is Rayyan El-Amin. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Islam Faris Institute. On behalf of the Director of the Institute, Dr. Tariq Mitri, who couldn't be with us today, he's in Brussels, I want to welcome you to today's talk with Ambassador Peter Galbraith. The title of the talk, it's a long title, but at the same time, I think it captures everything he's going to cover. The unraveling of the Near East, the breakup of Iraq, the war in Syria, and Iran's regional ambitions. I want to just read a short bio for Ambassador Peter Galbraith, and there's a lot more that he's done, so I'm just going to actually just hit on some main things. He is a former U.S. diplomat and a senior UN official. He earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard, a master's from Oxford University, and he has a JD from Georgetown University Law School. He is the author of 2 critically acclaimed books that concern this talk here today: The End of Iraq, How American Incompetence Created a War Without End, and his other book on Iraq is titled Unintended Consequences, How War in Iraq Strengthened America's Enemies. So with that, I'd like you to help me welcome Ambassador Galbraith. Yes, you just click it and it should be good.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I would say, just to add, I served as the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, and so now you'll understand why I began with a little story about the Balkans, which is that H.H. Munro, the short story writer, said of the Balkans, the problem with the Balkans is they produce more history than can be consumed locally. Now, he said that around 1912. In 1916, he died in a shell hole in France on a war that, of course, was started by a young Serbian man assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So with that opening cheerful thought in mind, I invite you to consider the events in the Near East, so just a little east of here, in this young century, really the centennial of the First World War. First, we have the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, followed by a civil war in Iraq between Sunnis and Shiites, followed by the Islamic State, or ISIS, taking over an area in Iraq and Syria that was greater than the territory of Great Britain, a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan where 93% of the population voted for independence, and the de facto partition of Syria along the Euphrates between a government-controlled area to the west and south of the river, and a Kurdish-controlled area to the north and west. Iran, of course, is an important factor in this mix. It is Assad's most important ally in the Syrian civil war. It's the longtime sponsor of the Shiite religious parties that now control Baghdad. It, of course, has its own divisions. 40 years after the Islamic Revolution, you have a division in Iran between more moderate elements that are represented by the elected government of President Rouhani, and perhaps in foreign policy by the foreign minister Zarif, and more conservative, unelected, and quite elderly elements represented by the Supreme Leader Khamenei. And as with the events in the Balkans a century ago, the outside powers just can't stay out. The United States initiated the upheavals with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has been remarkably unsuccessful in stabilizing the country. It unsuccessfully and, I must say, unenthusiastically tried to intervene in the efforts to topple Assad, and then it successfully intervened in support of Kurdish revolutionaries in northeast Syria who are defeating ISIS, and in support of Kurds in Iraq who also participated in the defeat of ISIS. Russia has used its air force to help Assad prevail against his adversaries, which do not include the Kurds. And of course, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been involved in the Syrian war. And finally, there's the very real prospect of a war between the United States and Iran. When I wrote these words, I just came from Oxford, where I gave a talk on the subject. The question was, will there be a war between the United States and Iran? This was 2 days ago. I said, well, much less likely now that John Bolton is gone. What did I know? We'll come to that. So let me turn to next one, if you will, to the three countries that I'm going to focus on. The first is Iraq. Iraq has been a fragile state since its inception, basically from the time that it was created in the aftermath of World War I, and a unemployed Sunni itinerant monarch, having been kicked out of Syria, was given the throne in Baghdad. Iraq's been ruled by Sunni Arabs, whose basic strategy has been to keep the Shiite majority down and the Kurds in. And this has been done throughout the 20th century with escalating violence. The violence, of course, included periodic repressions of rebellion in Kurdistan, but really culminating in the 1980s with the genocide against the Kurds, probably what you heard about from Kubad last week, the Anfal campaign, the use of chemical weapons, the systematic destruction of all the villages in Kurdistan. Incidentally, some of these were things that I witnessed. I had, for peculiar reasons, got permission to go through Kurdistan in 1987 as the villages were being destroyed, and I led a mission in '88 that documented the use of chemical weapons. And then the repression of the Shia, but particularly after the 1991 uprising against Saddam in the aftermath of his defeat in Kuwait. And then, of course, the United States goes in, and while the invasion is a great military success, the aftermath is a catastrophe borne out by a ignorance about what the actual situation in Iraq was, and an arrogance. But these problems were not caused by the United States. It's very simple to make that charge. In many ways, the Sunni Shia, the Kurdish issue has been there since the founding of Iraq. The Kurds never wanted to be part of Iraq, and they were never accepted as partners in Iraq, not from the day of its founding really to the present day. The Sunni Shiite divide, again, goes back to it doesn't quite go back 1,400 years. It does go back to the founding of Iraq, when the British decided the Sunnis were more reliable. But the real moment, I think, which redefined things was 1991. You had the first Gulf War, and in the middle of the first Gulf War, on the 14th of February 1991, George Bush the senior one, called on the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands. And in the aftermath of the defeat, an uprising began on the 3rd of March, 1991, in Basra. In a rather short period of time, it was up to the southern reaches of Baghdad, and then followed by absolutely horrific repression. And unfortunately, the United States allowed that to take place, having said that Iraq couldn't use its you fly, you die, no-fly zone. It then allowed them to use helicopters, allowed them to use tanks, and the uprising failed. But then in the aftermath of the Gulf War, you had the United States come in, terminate 90 years of Sunni rule, and pave the way for Iraq's Shiites, and in particular, Shiite Iraqi parties that had been strongly supported by Iran. One of them, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and you kind of get the sense from the name what the agenda might be, was actually founded in Tehran in 1982. The Sunnis, and by the Sunnis I mean not everyone, of course, but former Ba'athist tribal leaders, basically the Iraqi Sunni establishment, found it very difficult, in fact impossible, to accept that the country that they had controlled, where they had led an 8-year war against Iran that only ended 15 years before 2003, that had taken a huge number of lives, that now parties supported by Iran were going to be in power. And so you had, just as George Bush Jr. was proclaiming mission accomplished on the USS Lincoln, you had the beginning of a Sunni resistance, beginning in Anbar, the province of Iraq that is the most Sunni by population, about 96%. Initially hitting the Americans, but the Americans were hard targets. And so they moved on to basically Shiites, to first the Shiite religious leaders, blew up Bakr al-Hakim, the leader of Skiri in Najaf, then targeting pilgrims. And then it became simply a situation of just targeting ordinary Shiites. I was in Baghdad at a Kurdish friend's place on the banks of the Tigris, and I watched at one point there was an explosion, black smoke. About 5 minutes later, another explosion, and then about 25 minutes later, a third one. What had happened? The first one was at a bus station serving the south of Iraq, presumably overwhelmingly Shiite. The second was when people rushed in to help the people who had been injured, and the third was outside the hospital where the injured would be taken. And so it wasn't surprising that the Shiites responded with death squads. And the Sunnis then, well, even before, had welcomed the more extreme elements, the people who became Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. After all, as long as they were trying to kill Americans, they themselves didn't want to be suicide bombers. As long as they were killing Shiites, the Sunni establishment didn't mind at all. But as so often happens in revolutions, the more radical element then turned on their patrons. And this was in about 2006, 2007. They began to demand the daughters for forced marriages. They began to demand money, and they began to assassinate the Sunni establishment. At that point, the Sunni establishment, 2007, turned against them, went to the Americans and said, would you give us money if we get rid of al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia? The Americans said yes. Note, they didn't ask for arms because they had plenty. And incidentally, if the Americans had said no, the same thing would have happened. They got rid of them in a matter of some months. And so the American assumption was, the Bush administration, was that, well, now there can be a great reconciliation. We'll integrate the sons of Iraq, these Sunni militias who had defeated al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, into the Iraqi military and into the new Iraqi government and governmental system. The trouble was, and then when this didn't happen, 5 years later, you had ISIS coming and taking over Mosul, the largest, Iraq's second largest city, its largest Sunni city, in 36 hours. And everybody said it's the fault of the prime minister, Nouri al-Maliki, who was a sectarian. But you have to look at it from Maliki's point of view. You know, for whom do you have an Iraqi army to who are you defending yourself against? Not Iran. That certainly would have been at the top of Saddam Hussein's list. But Iran is now your closest ally. Not the Americans. They're also your ally. No, the people you're defending against are the Sunnis. And why? Because, in fact, they are the enemy. They have refused to accept the new Iraq, and Maliki understood that whatever had happened against al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia was tactical. So what happened in 2014? In 2014, fewer than 2,000 ISIS fighters, but maybe fewer than 1,000, armed with driving pickup trucks with machine guns, took Mosul in 36 hours, which was defended by 30,000 American-equipped Iraqi army soldiers. Now, it may have been that the number was less than that because there was a whole system of corruption and ghost soldiers and collecting pay for people who weren't actually there. But let's be generous and say the 1,000 or 2,000 took on 15,000. Now, how could that happen in about 36 hours? Well, a couple of things. First, the population sympathized with ISIS, not with the Iraqi army. It didn't see it as their army. And the army didn't see Mosul as their territory. And so when the attack came, nobody was prepared to die for Mosul. And so the Sunnis in the military simply took off their uniforms. Some maybe were already in touch and on the side of ISIS. The Shia officers fled to Iraqi Kurdistan and unfortunately left behind a certain number of their recruits who ended up being brutally executed in the videos that ISIS showed. About 2014, now I think it's fair to say that ISIS was worse than what the local population expected it to be. And so finally, when after 4 years, the Iraqi counterterrorism force, the Peshmerga, Kurdish Peshmerga, and the Americans, supported by the Americans, retook the city, that was probably welcomed by most people. But the problem hasn't been solved. The people who ended up, I don't want to suggest that the Shiite forces were cowardly. When ISIS began to push down toward Samarra, which is the site of one of the holiest Shiite shrines, people turned out voluntarily to join Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and basically stopped ISIS. And those forces are now the forces that are around Mosul, and they're not treating either the Sunni or Christian populations particularly well. And so many of the people that I talk to in Iraq, and particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan, certainly expect that this issue is going to be revisited. You also have the issue of what are you going to do with there are about maybe 30,000 Iraqis in camps in Syria that are run by the Syrian Kurds, ISIS fighters, and some thousands of Iraqi fighters. What's happening is that those that have been repatriated, both the women and the fighters, are getting basically 15-minute trials and death sentences. And to the extent that people are not executed but remain in the camps are places where future radicals are educated. So, the problem basically remains. So that's the Sunni and Shiites in Iraq. I want to emphasize that it isn't that the Sunnis, this is a case of a country where the Sunnis want to secede from Iraq. No, it's simply that they both claim Iraq as their country, but they do not share a common view of what Iraq is or should be, and they're not prepared to have one govern the other. The Kurds are entirely a separate issue. As I said already, they never wanted to be part of Iraq. They've always felt that they were a minority, and of course this is understandable. For all its history until 2005, Iraq defined itself as an Arab state. Well, guess what? If you're not an Arab, then it's not your state. I mean, you're a minority. You're a second-class citizen. Never mind the repression that actually took place. And then, of course, this culminating in the genocide, which probably took 4 or 5% of the Kurdish population. So you had a rather different history, though, after the first Gulf War, in that while the Shiite rebellion was repressed and the Americans stood aside, in the case of the Kurdish rebellion, which began in a place called Rania on the 6th of March of 1991, and took over all of Kurdistan within a few days, the Iraqis counterattacked on the weekend of March 28th. I remember it vividly because I happened to be there, having been invited to come visit by Talabani, and it was the unfortunate point that it was the same weekend that the Iraqi army decided to come, but anyhow. And they reconquered much of it, including the major cities, not just Kirkuk, but Dahak, Erbil, and Sulaymaniyah. But then the Kurds fled to the mountains, and you now had the first, what was called the CNN effect, the first images that were really brought into people's living room of this immense human suffering. And this led a very reluctant, first President Özal of Turkey, who urged an intervention on behalf of the Kurds, who were right on the Turkish border, and then John Major of the new British Prime Minister, and finally George Bush relented. The U.S. simply ordered the Iraqi army out of there. There was no fighting. They left. The Kurds returned, and although this was meant to be a temporary humanitarian measure, in fact, it became a de facto independent state from 1991 on. And the Kurds have loved it, and they've built a lot out of it. And they absolutely do not want to be part of Iraq. So in 2005, when it came time to negotiate the Iraqi constitution, the Kurds made proposals for how a federal system would work. Now, if you look at their proposals, they said, let's have a separate rule for Kurdistan. But the Shiites who dominated said, no, it has to be the same rule for everybody. Kurds said, fine. So what the Iraqi constitution provides is that you can have a region, and there are specified in Article 110 of the Iraqi constitution the exclusive powers of the federal government. And it is the shortest list possible because the Kurdish goal in these negotiations was just that. So it includes foreign policy, it includes national security policy, but not all of the military. It includes international trade, and I think weights and measures so that a kilometer in Basra should be the same as a kilometer in Erbil. Beyond that, there's nothing else. It doesn't, for example, include taxation. Article 115, that's Article 110. Article 115 says if it's not listed in Article 110, then regional law is superior to federal law. And just in case you don't get the point, Article 121, which relates to the power of regions, which says the Kurdistan region is a region, says that regions, of which Kurdistan was the only one at the time, can have their own parliament, their own president, that regions have the power to amend or cancel any federal law, except those in that very small list of Article 110. So if there was a federal tax law, since that's not in Article 110, a region could cancel or amend it. And then regions are allowed to have their own military. They're called the guards of the region, which translates into Kurdish as Peshmerga. So it's hard to imagine a more decentralized kind of arrangement. I suppose if this had applied to the European Union, Britain would have been quite happy and there'd be no Brexit. But that didn't really satisfy the Kurds because their real goal is to have their own state. And in 2014, that they seemed on the verge of having it, which is to say ISIS came in, it took over basically all the Sunni areas, and as President Barzani said to me in June of 2014, said, what can we do? We have a border of 1,030 kilometers with the Islamic State, and we have a border of 15 kilometers with Iraq. We should declare independence. But the Americans flew in and said, yes, we know you want independence, that's fine, just don't do it right now. And I have to say, very unwisely, they listened to the Americans. It's not my advice to listen to them, but they did, to Secretary of State Kerry. Then, of course, there was the attack on Kurdistan. And when ISIS attacked Kurdistan, it was well armed with American weapons. And, it turns out that if you're manning a checkpoint and you've got some guy coming at you in a Toyota Corolla who you think's a suicide bomber, you can open up your AK-47 and spray the windshield and it's not going to get to you. But if the suicide bomber is coming in an American Humvee, which is, of course, all hardened and can carry a lot more explosives, you're going to be blown to the high heavens. And so the Kurds were pushed back. At this stage, the Americans intervened, and then the Kurds played a major role in the defeat of the Islamic State. But in September of, why don't you continue? This shows the disposition of the Kurds. Even that's the Kurdistan region, which is not the same as the Kurdish areas. And then the next one. Next slide. That was that one there. In September 25th, 2017, they went ahead and had a referendum on independence. Now, the referendum, which was called by President Masoud Barzani, enacted as a law by the parliament, was a binding referendum, but not a self-executing one. And you had the most extraordinary turnout and enthusiasm. If you look at these pictures, you kind of have the feeling there couldn't possibly be any more red, white, yellow, or green dye in Erbil. The results were, again, huge turnout, not the slightest element of coercion or fraud, 93% for independence. Rather better performance than the referendum that was held in Catalonia a week later, which was disrupted by the Spanish government. And afterwards, things didn't exactly turn out well. The Iraqi army, or not the Iraqi army, but the Hashd al-Shabi attacked. They took Kirkuk, and the Kurds put this on hold. And I'll come back to what the U.S. did at this time. But it was I'll give you a very straightforward rule that where you have people in a geographically defined area that unanimously don't want to be part of a country, that unanimously want to have independence, sooner or later they're going to get it. No Iraqi can say with a straight face that the Kurds want to be part of Iraq. And sooner or later people have to adjust to that, and will. At least that's the historical experience to that reality. Things, and perhaps you heard this from Kubat, are somewhat better with the Prime Minister Abdel-Mahdi, but he himself doesn't have any real support. So the underlying forces are ones that are not sympathetic to what the Kurds want to do. Okay, enough of Iraq for a moment. Let me turn to Syria. This too is, keep going next. Well, you can be on this one for a moment. Well, the next one is the map that I wanted to show. So, as I said, Syria is effectively divided on the Tigris. In fact, there have been 2 wars in Syria that, of course, as I think anybody here knows, began in 2011, and both of these wars are basically over. In the war which began between the government or the regime and a whole range of opposition groups from democratically oriented to more jihadi, the government has won, it's prevailed. The fighting isn't quite over because there's a pocket of resistance up in Idlib, and there's a Turkish-controlled area north of Aleppo and Afrin, but the outcome is not in doubt. And then there was an entirely separate war in the north and east of the country between the Syrian Kurds, who have renamed themselves in a variety of ways and are now the Syrian Democratic Forces, intended to give the impression that it's something more than a Kurdish movement, and indeed there are Arab tribes who participate, but nonetheless it is basically a Kurdish-run movement, which has, with American help, totally defeated the Islamic State. Their last bit of territory was seized earlier this year in Barghuz. They now have about 90,000 women and children in camps, and 15,000 fighters, none of whom, the enthusiasm for fighting to the death turned out to be somewhat less than people thought. And it's really unclear what's going to happen in Syria now. On the government side, you have the Iranians and the Russians. The Russians are not really willing to support operations against the Kurds, and certainly not ones that will have them tangle with the Americans. America's Turkish ally would like to do something about the Kurds, but seems to have accepted a compromise of a safe zone, which is significantly a face-saving exercise. And just as the war in Iraq had a religious and ethnic component, the wars in Syria have a religious and ethnic component. One of the, questions you have to ask is, how is it that Assad survived when Mubarak and Ben Ali fell? And I think the answer to that is, in the case of Ben Ali in Tunisia, who lost when he fell? Well, Ben Ali and his family and maybe some businessmen around him, and they all left and went to Saudi Arabia. In the case of Egypt, it was Mubarak and his family and some businessmen, some of the generals who supported him. And when he fell, what happened? Well, Mubarak and his sons ended up in prison. Some generals are retired and now spend their time playing golf. And so there were not a huge number of losers. But what would have happened in Syria, at least as perceived in Syria? Almost from the beginning of the uprising against Assad, and there was an element of it that was radical or hostile to the Alawite community and to the Christian community. There were slogans that basically went, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. And so what I would argue to you is that the Syrian uprising never reached a tipping point. It's not because Alawites and Christians and Druze love Assad. It is because they were more fearful or uncertain about what the alternative was. And so you know, if you think of Syria's population, 10-12% Alawite, ostensibly 10% Christian, but probably a lot less. 5% Druze or whatever the figures are, another couple of percentage of Shiite. You add that up, it's about 20% of people who would have felt really imperiled, or imperiled. Maybe they weren't, but if the regime fell, add to that a lot of secular Sunnis who had done quite well in the Assad period, and who might have switched sides if they'd seen the regime toppling. They never saw it toppling. And I think that's the key to understanding how it is that it succeeded. And then, of course, the war, the other war, the one between the Kurds and the Islamic State, really had a very religious component, a religious and ethnic component to it. The Islamic State had the ideology, I think, that you all know. The Kurdish side is very much steeped in the doctrine of Murray Bookchin, a philosopher from my own state of Vermont, whose ideas he was inspired by Bernie Sanders. When Bernie Sanders, now the senator and presidential candidate, became mayor of Burlington, and he moved from New Jersey to Vermont to help create the People's Republic of Burlington, and he wrote a number of writings that dealt with strict gender equality, complete secularism, no ethnic nature, big strict environmentalism, workers' self-management. And so what you've got set up in northeast Syria is something quite remarkable and the antithesis of what the Islamic State stood for. So it's secular. One point I was talking with the leaders and I said, well, Bernard Kouchner, I said, we'll come back next month, but it's Ramadan. Would that be okay? And they say, well, you're telling us. We didn't know it was Ramadan. And you have the situation where half the legislators in their cantons are women. They're co-prime ministers, so one man, one woman. Their military, half the generals are women. Anyhow, obviously, again, the opposite of what the Islamic State stood for. So you do have an element between a radical religious entity and something that was quite secular. Let me turn to Iran and the United States. Obviously, and just if we go back to that slide, that shows the situation now, and the next one shows what it was in 2014. I mean, just the extraordinary change in the map, and particularly for the Kurdish area. That little dot right in the center is Kobani, which was under siege. And if you go back to the previous one, you see how far the Kurds moved when they took territory from the Islamic State. In the case of Iran, now Donald Trump gave three reasons for pulling out of the nuclear deal and setting off the current set of tensions. The first was that the nuclear deal had a sunset. Not that Iran was free to make nuclear weapons after 15 years. In fact, even the intrusive inspections would continue, but there were certain other parts of it that would fall away in 15 years. Secondly, that it didn't cover ballistic missiles, although it was a deal about nuclear issues, not ballistic missiles. And third, that it did nothing about Iran's malign activities in the region. And I want to focus on Iran's malign activities in the region. In particular cited were Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Well, let's first deal with Iraq. I think, well, those who are students may not recall this, but of those of a certain age may remember that in 2003, when President George W. Bush gave his State of the Union address, this is before the invasion of Iraq, he referred to an axis of evil between Iraq, Saddam Hussein, Iran of the Ayatollahs, and North Korea. Now, I know you students, the students here at the American University of Beirut have some basic mathematics and geometry, so you do know that an axis is going to be between 2 points and three, not three. So it was a geometrically challenged statement. But it was meant to evoke the World War II Axis powers, which was also historically faulty because the World War II axis was between 2 points, namely Berlin and Rome. And Japan was not an Axis power. It was allied to the Axis, but anyhow, why should we get into details? The most important point about the Axis, World War II axis, is that Hitler and Mussolini were allies. Saddam and the Ayatollahs in Iran were the most bitter enemies in the world. So what did the U.S. do? It invaded Iraq. It made possible entirely through democratic elections. I don't think anybody will question the democratic outcome for Iran's closest allies to become the government of Iraq. And so there is today a Baghdad-Tehran axis created by the United States. So to me, it's a little presumptuous to then complain about malign activities that the United States itself created. And in fact, the Iranians have been restrained in their activities in Iraq because, after all, although they did send in troops and forces when ISIS was moving in on Samarra, then the Americans jumped in, and so the Iranian attitude was, well, if the Americans go send weapons and money, we don't need to do that. Why should we spend it? They're just coming to help our allies. In the aftermath of the Kurdistan referendum, the Iranians were, of course, very much opposed to Kurdistan's independence. And they aligned with the Shiite militia, the Hashd al-Shabi, in an operation that Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian, one of the most important figures in Iran, the head of the Al-Quds force, he directed. He was in Iraq at the time, but it was commanded by a guy named Abu Mahdi Muhandis. Remember that name, Abu Mahdi Muhandis. This was 3 days after Trump announced the withdrawal from the Iran deal because of Iran's malign activities. The Trump administration then allowed Abu Mahdi Muhandis' militia to use American Abrams tanks against the Kurds in Kirkuk. Oh, what about Abu Mahdi Muhandis? Yeah, well, he was sentenced to death in Kuwait in absentia in the 1980s for blowing up the American embassy. So let me just suggest that whatever you may think about Iran's activities in Iraq, they were created by the United States and even facilitated by the Trump administration itself in the single most important Shiite and Iranian-backed activity perhaps since 2003, namely the retaking of Kirkuk from the Kurds. So I would suggest there's a lot of confusion and, to be honest, an enormous amount of ignorance, although there is another explanation. When you commit an error in life, one of the things that you're probably advised to do is to admit the error and change course. But I think you'll find out that the larger the error, the more likely you and institutions are to compound it, to double down. The error being the invasion of Iraq and basically handing the country over to Iran's allies. And the United States, its strategy is that the more support we give to the Iraqi government, the better the chance we have of weaning them away from the Iranians. Of course, the Iranians find that just to be fine. In Syria, the malign activities are ones that go back to the 1980s when Syria was the only country to support Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. The United States eventually, and Trump has said that he wants to get out of Syria, it disengaged from a rather half-hearted and poorly thought-out effort to aid the anti-Assad opposition. But the Iranians have done nothing against the forces that the United States is supporting, namely the Kurds. And then there's Yemen, which is a war that that was, well, what you had had was the Houthis take over in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. But who are the Houthis? They are significantly the Zaydis, the Shiites, the people who had run Yemen for about 1,300 years. While Iran may be providing support, I think logistically its ability to reach Yemen is limited. We now see a series of Houthi responses and attacks onto Saudi territory, the missiles launched on Saudi airfields in Riyadh, for example. But is that an entirely unjustified response to the bombing of the massive bombing of Yemeni, not only the Houthi forces who control the capital, but also of civilians? Let me just conclude, and I learned some time ago that when you give a talk, you always use phrases like "finally" or "let me conclude" because it gives your audience hope. Let me just say a word about the United States and Iran. Is there any real logic to the hostility between the United States and Iran? It goes back to the U.S. role in restoring the Shah in 1953 and ousting Mossadegh. 1953 was some time ago. And then, of course, the Americans are angry about the hostage-taking in 1979. That was 40 years ago. 53 is 66 years ago. Math is right. But if you sort of step back, you also find just how congruent American and Iranian interests are. For example, they both have a great hostility to Sunni extremism. After all, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, they consider Christians are people of the book. They may have to pay the tax. Shiites are apostates to be killed. The Taliban in, I think it was 99, took over Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan, seized the Iranian consulate there, and massacred the Iranian diplomats. The Iranians almost went in to get rid of the Taliban. After 9/11, where incidentally The word of the attacks came in the afternoon in Tehran, and there was a football match, and the whole crowd stood up. There was a minute of silence and mourning for the victims, just minutes after the news arrived. But when the U.S. went after the Taliban, the Iranians said, if your planes get hit, you can land them in Iran, or if your pilots have to bail out, we'll rescue them and return them. And they were extremely appreciative of the fact that the U.S. got rid of the Taliban, stopped the genocide of the Afghan, and this is not a much reported story, but of the Hazaras, the Central Highlands, who were in the process of being exterminated. And then again, the U.S. got rid of Saddam Hussein. That was another Iranian objective. They spent 8 years trying to do it, and 750,000 lives, no success. So, as I said, there's a commonality of interest. And you also have to ask about the commonality of interest that the United States has, as opposed to perhaps the business relationship of the person and family who are occupying the White House with Saudi Arabia and its current ruler. Consider the record of the current ruler of Saudi Arabia. A reckless war in Yemen, which is taking hundreds of thousands of lives. Locking up members of the royal family and other wealthy Saudis and shaking them down. I think there was some were tortured, and one may have been killed in the process of that. A blockade of Qatar, which had the effect of making Qatar closer to Iran. Inducing the prime minister of Lebanon to come to Saudi Arabia and then intimidating him, locking him up, and forcing him to resign. Not to mention sending a team of 15 people to your consulate in Istanbul with bone saws for the express purpose of killing and cutting into pieces a minor Saudi dissident who occasionally wrote for the Washington Post. And then there's the other impulsive actions, buying a yacht that you see for $500 million on the spur of the moment, a possible Leonardo da Vinci for about the same amount, and a chateau in France. In any event, I think you can look at that record and wonder whether that really is a reliable partner. And I would say, if you had Americans who knew anything about the region, and I was at the Council on Foreign Relations and a little working group on Iran, on the Gulf, and I said to the group, about 25 people, if you had to live in Iran or Saudi Arabia, how many would choose Iran? 23. 2 were going to choose Saudi Arabia. So, there's also, Iran is one of the more liberal countries in this part of the world. And if you really thought about a strategy toward Iran, you might do what the United States did in late 1980s when new leadership came to Russia. There were a lot of people, including John Bolton, who said Gorbachev's a total fraud. He's only doing it's a KGB plot to demonstrate that he's reasonable. But Reagan, to his credit, didn't buy that. Said, well, let's see what Gorbachev can produce. And so we improved relations with the Soviet Union, and the rest is history. I went to the Soviet Union in 1968 as a teenager. I was 17. I traveled around the country with a bunch of college students in VW minibuses. And I also spent time in Eastern Europe. And I was struck by one thing. First, I was struck by the fact that it wasn't really all that powerful or successful a country, so it wasn't the future. But the other thing I was struck by was that nobody actually believed in communism. In fact, the only people who believed in communism, who thought it was a powerful system, were right-wing Republicans in the United States. They thought it was terrific, so terrific that it could never be undone. And I went to Iran in 2015, and I've talked to a lot of people who've been there. You know, you have some of the same thing. You do not encounter very many people who actually believe in the Islamic State or the way the government's running. Now, there are lots of people who participate, because just as there were people who participated in communism, because that's the careerist thing to do. But my view is that once the belief is gone, the system can't last forever. Now, it takes a while. It was 21 years between, certainly after 1968 and the invasion of Czechoslovakia, there was nobody who believed in communism, or almost nobody. It took 21 years before it collapsed in '89. But I think you see something fairly similar in Iran. So again, if you were to have a more sensible U.S. strategy, it might involve trying to have better relations with Iran. It also would probably be a good idea not to pull out of agreements that are actually working and where the Iranian side is actually honoring them, but leave that aside. Better relations, less hostility, and leave it the opportunity for the more moderate Iranian leaders and the people to change things. So let me stop there, and however you want to proceed.
Okay, I think we have plenty of time now to have some Q&A and some discussion on the very far-reaching and quite broad territory that was covered in the last hour, 45 minutes to an hour from Ambassador Galbraith. I think the main rules are to go ahead and collect a couple of questions and then come back to you. When you do pose your question, please keep it short. Even your comments, keep them short, and let us know your name and your position or whatever. Yes.
Thank you very much. This is not really a question, it's a comment, and I'd like to congratulate Galbraith for speaking about the Middle East for, by my counting, a little more than an hour without mentioning just once the name of Israel.
Okay.
The question was, I managed to spend an entire hour talking about this part of the world without saying one word, Israel. I did mention the Prime Minister of Lebanon. Let me just come back to that, because it was not accidental. If you think of Syria and you think of Hafiz al-Assad, you can well imagine that every morning he got up thinking of Israel. Probably had quite a few meetings in the course of the day about what Syria was going to do about Israel. He probably went to bed at night thinking about Israel. I dare say Bashar al-Assad doesn't think about Israel that much. And this is part of the way in which this area has evolved, in an area where the Sunni-Shiite divide is very central, where the Kurdish factor, the drive for independence in Iraq, the role of the Kurds in Syria, the issues in Turkey. It's the number one issue in Turkey, and it's an issue that has engaged the United States as well as Turkey and to some degree Russia. The issue of Israel, namely Israel and the Palestinians, is it's a second, third, or fourth tier issue, which is not to say that it isn't a tragedy for the Palestinians. I don't want to suggest that, but it is not a central geopolitical issue. All right.
Muna?
Hi, we're going to put back a tiny bit. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very specific questions. The first, kind of relating to your conclusion about Iran, you put forward a very interesting position about how the U.S. foreign policy should be vis-a-vis Iran. How would you craft the position vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict for Israel, from the perspective of of the United States government. And the other question is, we've read a lot in the Israeli press celebrations of Trump's position and giving credit to Netanyahu for actually having influenced American foreign policy. Do you buy it? Do you think Israel is playing a critical role there? Thank you.
Take another question, comment? Yes.
You have really articulated quite well how haphazard American policies and interventions in the region have led us to this mess. But why do you think anyone in this region should have to choose between Saudi Arabia or Iran? Why should we be, I mean, I'm thinking of Lebanon, of Syria. Why should we be the flashpoint for this tug of war between them? It has had terrible consequences, and it may still have terrible consequences for the region if we choose one side over the other.
These are meaty questions, so why don't we go back to Ambassador Galbraith to answer these, and then we'll get some more questions.
All right, first, I'm going to address your question. Yeah, it is a mess, and certainly the consequences were unintended from the point of view of what the United States wanted to do. It certainly, the Bush people having described an axis of evil, obviously it wasn't their intention to create one. But not all the outcomes are in fact bad, in my opinion. You know, why is it a bad idea for the majority to run Iraq, or at least to run the parts of Iraq where they live? I mean, it's called democracy. So I'm
not talking about Iraq.
No, I just want to come to. I want to just sort of frame this, and certainly from my point of view, what's wrong with the Kurds having their own state? It's something they want. I tend to think people who want to have a state are entitled to that, which will come to the question about Israel. So in terms of having to make a choice, well, I guess I would argue that one doesn't have to make a choice. And I think I'm arguing for a U.S. policy that doesn't make a choice. I'm not saying we cut off Saudi Arabia or choose Iran over Saudi Arabia. I'm just going to say, let's stop choosing Saudi Arabia and hating Iran. I mean, let's try to have the best possible relations with the two sides, and we will judge states by their behavior. And certainly some behaviors, like killing American residents and cutting them up into pieces, is not tolerable, and it's very hard to have normal relations with a leader who does that. And there are other things that you could say that might make comparable issues with the Iranians. And certainly a country like Lebanon ought not to have to choose. But I think it's no secret that, shall we say, Lebanon's politics are not just about what goes on within the borders of this country. I was up in Baalbek and visited the Shiite shrine there, and I couldn't help but notice a couple of figures in the mosaics who were not either historic or Lebanese. And obviously the Saudis have a role as well. So, but I agree with your point. Now, coming back to the Arab-Israeli issue, the first point I'd make is, fortunately, I'm not an expert on it, because to me, it's like, from the point of view of U.S. policy, it's like Groundhog Day, the same thing over and over and over again. And I also wouldn't even define it as an Arab-Israeli issue. It's an Israeli-Palestinian issue at this point. I mean, one of the consequences of the various peace agreements, the Egypt-Israel one, the Jordan-Israel one, is to narrow it to being a Palestinian-Israeli issue. And certainly Netanyahu has had great influence on American policy. I don't think the decisions are good decisions, but it's hard to argue, but that he hasn't been successful, I will say. I'm not sure that this really reflects what the American people think. Remember, the person who occupies the White House lost the election by 3 million votes and is only in office because we have an 18th century constitution whose electoral system was created, had the effect of benefiting slave owners. And, I think the Constitution is quite brilliant, but I have a little hard time worshiping a document written entirely by white guys, half of whom owned other people as slaves. I mean, it is capable of being changed. That's an aside. What do I think? I don't know what's going to happen, but here's, the Palestinian Charter, I mean, the original one, did not speak of two states, but of a single state of Palestinians, of Jews and Arabs. I'm kind of wondering whether this isn't where Netanyahu is going to end up, not intentionally, but just imagine. You've annexed Jerusalem, you've annexed the Golan Heights, now you're going to annex the Jordan Valley. And at some point, sooner or later, the left is going to win an Israeli election. Nobody keeps, maybe even this time, if there's a big enough Arab turnout, nobody stays in power forever. So what are you going to do if you're a more left-wing Israeli government and you want to win elections and Arab voters are the people who help you win elections? You extend the franchise. And so in the end, you may not, you may have a single state and it may not be a Jewish state. I mean, the two, 1984, I made my first trip to Israel and I had lunch with Abba Eban, and he had said something I think you probably have heard, but he said to me, and guys said it to lots of people, he said Israel can be two of the following three. It can be a Jewish state, it can be a democracy, and it can have, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. You can't do all three. So if you want to have the West Bank and be a Jewish state, you can't be a democracy. You want to be a democracy and a Jewish state, you can't have all the Palestinian land. So I don't know where it will turn out, but I'm guessing that that the present course is not sustainable for the right wing in Israel. I mean, they're a few votes away. I mean, the Knesset's pretty equally balanced.
Two balanced by two parties that are on the right wing against any sort of giving up anything for Palestinians. That's the problem I think a lot of us see as far as the divide within the Israeli parties. There isn't much there in terms of differences as far as how they see the Palestinians. But that's
it depends on
the blue and white party and Netanyahu's Likud party have.
Yeah, but it depends on how you get to power.
Right.
To take an example in Turkey, you might have said that everybody in Turkey was against the Kurds, but at a certain point, Erdogan managed to win the support of the Kurds. And this gave him a super majority, and then he began to adopt a program. I mean, when I first got involved in the Kurdish question with the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I made a trip in '88 along the Iraq-Turkey border interviewing the survivors of poison gas attacks in Iraq. At that time, when I did the report, which was published, I referred to a person from the U.S. consulate in Adana who had helped and done interpretation. I said, Hamza Uluce was an ethnic Kurd, and it got him into a huge amount of trouble. Well, some 20 years later, Erdogan is allowing broadcasting in Kurdish, schooling in Kurdish. He goes to Diyarbakir, and Masoud Barzani comes there with him. They have the flag of Kurdistan of Iraqi Kurdistan, and Erdogan speaks some words of Kurdish. Now he's he's adopted a new course of action, but votes do count, and for a period of time until 2014, Erdogan was getting Kurdish votes. What I'm going to argue to you is that whatever the Israeli politics is going to turn on how you win elections.
Yes, Karim.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just a couple of quick questions. I want to join my colleagues to say that I think it's difficult to talk about unraveling the Near East without talking about Palestine and Israel. It's very difficult historically and still to this day, given what's happening both in Iran and here in this whole region, the drones, the possible conflicts that are taking place. I would say that in Palestine and Israel, it's not just a question of elections, because once you have an apartheid system set up, there is legal discrimination between the Palestinians, not in the West Bank only, but actually inside 48. So it's not a similar kind of setup. So that's just to push back on that and to say that it still remains central to this region, even though a lot of people outside want to try to still push it to the sidelines. The second thing I'd just actually like to ask you, if you could talk a bit about the current Trump administration setup. Who has influence? What are the different factions? Who should we be paying attention to? Which foundations, which institutes, which individuals should we be looking at to see what's going on? Thank you.
We'll go over here and then over here. Sorry, Noor, I'll come back to you afterwards. Yeah. Omar?
Sorry.
Louder, please.
Omar Syria, PhD student at the University of Toronto and an affiliate here at IFI. I just have a specific question and then a kind of a background as to why I'm asking. Majority of your presentation was about Iraq, and I wonder how do you, in your analysis, account for the lack of popularity or lack of popular support for politicians in the country, generally, from the north to the south? And the reason I ask that question is because it's kind of, I think, a background theme that has kind of plagued Iraq for the last, well, since 2003, if not before. And you can kind of even track this to kind of key moments in the history that you tracked, the constitutional process that I know you were involved in, had really kind of was completely out of touch with the Iraqi people, was not really supported by huge swaths of the Iraqi population. The civil war that you referenced kind of took place 3 or 4 months after the referendum, constitutional referendum in 2005. Speaking of referendums, even the popular referendum that was widely supported, as you said, by the Kurdish population in the north, which was really, really obviously very important, also did not actually turn into anything for the Kurdish people who have been demanding this as well. So it seemed a political ploy by political figures in Kurdistan, which by many accounts kind of backfired in terms of its result. And there are a number of other kind of examples we can talk about. So I guess the question, what I'm really asking is, how do you account for this lack of popularity? Haider Abadi, in his own home district of Karade, had 10 to 15% support in the last election, which he obviously lost. I mean, even in his home district, he couldn't get turnout. So, which I think also problematizes the kind of these identitarian maps that have kind of plagued Western analysis of Iraq for the last 15 or 16 years that we kind of see where Shia, Kurd, Sunni. So, so the question that is just I'm trying to ask there is, how do you account for the lack of popularity for politicians inside the country in your analysis? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Want to take those two, and then we'll go to the other two.
First, on the question of whether the Palestinian issue is central to this part of the world, I just don't think it is. I'm sure it's central to Lebanon and central to the Palestinians, but I don't think it has any traction. Maybe it's sad that it's true. I certainly think the Palestinians are entitled to self-determination, just like I think the Kurds are entitled to self-determination. So I'm not, and I am not an admirer of Mr. Netanyahu. But the reality, I'm just describing a reality. I mean, not the world as I wish it was, but as it is. It's not important to the Egyptians. I don't think it's important to the Syrians, any of the factions in Syria. It's just the reality. The second, on the setup, the Trump administration's setup, let me just say, when you have a president who cancels a state visit to a NATO ally, Denmark, because they won't discuss selling Greenland, how do you expect me to give you a rational account of decision-making or who has influence? Okay? So let me try to deal with the question about Iraq. I don't agree with you that the architects of the Constitution were out of touch with the Iraqi people at all. The Kurds got what they wanted. That's 20% of the Iraqi people. They wanted the weakest possible Iraqi state, the strongest possible Kurdistan, and they voted in that referendum, I don't know, 98% in October 2005. I think the Shiites pretty much got what they wanted. You look at the votes in the Shiite governorates, huge turnout, huge endorsement of the Constitution. The people who didn't get what they wanted were the Sunnis. And I would also argue that it was impossible to give the Sunnis what they wanted, because I sat, I sat in, not in the negotiations, but I was staying in the place where they took place. And I talked to all of them. I mean, basically, Salih Mutlaq, what he wanted was for the Kurds not to have what they wanted. He wanted a centralized state. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you bring your demands down to a binary one, my desire is for you not to have what you want, and you're in a stronger position, I'm not going to get my way. Too bad. But that was just the reality, and that's why the country doesn't work and isn't likely to stay together. In terms of the lack of popular support for politicians, I mean, when you have multiple elections, politicians tend to become unpopular. First, there's nothing new in Iraq. I mean, I doubt if the king was popular or any of the kings. There were successive coups against the people who replaced him. Saddam was not a popular guy. So these guys may be the least unpopular among Iraq's politicians as compared to those who preceded them. I'll say about the Kurdistan referendum. I've known Masoud Barzani since 1991. I think I could say that this was not a political ploy to strengthen his position, and it was not one that backfired. He considers it, and a friend of mine was a journalist, just talked to him, he considers the referendum to be the biggest achievement of his life. Why? Because he has done what has been the historic family mission. By the time he held the referendum, he was 70 years old. 1946, so 71 years old, and in a family where people don't live that long. What his goal was, his dream was to bring Kurdistan to independence, to do something that his father never, in his wildest dreams, imagined could be achieved. And he's come very close. And he, I think he agonized over the fact that his term was extended. And he always had it in mind that he was not going to continue. So at least I don't think it was a ploy that backfired on him at all. I think it accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. In terms of support for the Kurdish leaders, it's varied. I think the Barzanis are extremely popular in Duhok governorate, and you can see that in the election results. Less popular in other parts of Kurdistan. But one of the things you find in around the world, and I've been in a number of these situations, the national card is extremely popular up until the point when it's achieved. And then the people who achieve it, people start to look at other things, economics, good governance, and so on. But and they stop worrying about nationalism. In some ways, it's a self-extinguishing phenomena. But until it's achieved, then the people who represent the national card are popular, and I would say that's true for Barzani, because that's what he represents. Maybe in the same way that Yasser Arafat remained popular. No, those are different. I mean, no, these are genuinely free. I mean, they may not be totally without problem, but these are genuinely free elections. And even in Dahak Governorate, the only party to achieve 50% in any governorate in Iraq was the KDP in Dahak Governorate. Was there any other? Abadi, he made the same miscalculation that Winston Churchill made, that George Bush Sr. made, of thinking that military victory equals political victory. Called his party victory, and he finished third.
More question, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay, this is not functioning. I don't know why. Yeah. Okay. To begin with, I would like to draw your attention to an interview. Douglas Faith, one of the neocons, along with Don Rumsfeld, appeared on Jazeera English a couple of weeks ago, and they said their words, and I'm trying to quote them, that the first war of destruction waged against Iraq was with the intention of letting Israel gain a strategic upper hand in the whole area, in the whole Middle East, and it was corroborated by Don Rumsfeld. This is one thing. With regards, of course, to the first invasion of 2003. Now, with regards to the social revolution, which was, the whole of Syria and Iraq and the Western Asia was in the throes of social revolution. I would like you to comment on why secular democratic forces have failed, to make inroads, letting the Islamists, the different shades of Islamists, gain the upper hand in this. And thank you.
Noura?
I just wanted to go back a little bit to the US-Iran standoff at the moment. How much traction or credence will the claim made today by US military officials that they have satellite photos proving that Iran was actually behind the attacks against the Saudi oil installations? That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question is, are the Saudis and the Israelis pushing this agenda that we thought, as you had said in Oxford, that things are looking up now that John Bolton is out of the picture? Now we see a totally opposing momentum take hold. So where do you see things going?
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned a lot about independent Kurdish states and stuff like that. In the event that happened, I'm just wondering, because it'll be from Iraq, and there are 2 times as many Kurds in Turkey, for example, as in Iraq, there would obviously be quite a bit of immigration. Do you think, in your opinion, there's enough cultural homogeneity among all Kurds across the region to make that state viable?
And go ahead.
The question about the upcoming elections, presidential elections. It seems the unraveling started under a Republican president, but then President Obama didn't do much regarding Syria. Is there hope for the region? We seem to be screwed, whether it's the Republican Party or a Democratic Party that rules the White House. What are your thoughts?
Okay. I don't know anything about what Rumsfeld and Feith said. I must say I'd be surprised if they ever said such a thing. My view is that they had a different agenda, which was that they had the fantasy that that the Iraqis were the Germans of the Middle East. You get rid of their Hitler, that it will become there was a single Iraqi. There was such a thing as an Iraqi people. They would unite, and it would be a revolution it would be like 1989 in the Middle East. I think that was what they thought. But I didn't listen to the interview, so I can't comment on it. on the question of social revolution, that actually comes back to the question over here. Why didn't the Democratic parties gain traction any place? Because right now, what's going in is about identity politics. And when, it's ridiculous to say that's out of touch. That's how people are voting. The Kurds are voting for the parties that will bring about Kurdistan. That's what they want to see. The Shiites are voting for Shiite religious parties because that's an expression of their, I'm talking about in Iraq, that's their identity. I would argue in Syria, one reason that Assad survived is that the minorities felt that their identity was under threat and even their survival. Certainly the Kurds in northeast Syria, while they have this kind of very interesting philosophical agenda, at their heart, they're about being Kurds and Kurdish rights and Kurdish language. They're not separatists there, but still. In terms of what the U.S. military, it's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, if you're going to be using your Air Force to be bombing the hell out of civilians in Yemen and causing famine and all the other things that Mohammed bin Salman is doing, you shouldn't be surprised if your adversary does something to try to harm you. Now, the question is, did that attack come from the Houthis or did it come from someplace else? I mean, I have to say drones are pretty sophisticated, and that's a long way from Yemen. I'll note that Pompeo's, was it Pompeo or Trump, said that the attacks came from the northwest, and that must be Iranian. And that there were cruise missiles and so on. Well, let's see. But the New York Times has pictures today that said the attacks came from the west. And the holes, you can see the pictures. What I will tell you, though, is here is the genuine legacy of George W. Bush in 2003. The American people are not going to believe what the administration has to say. It's the legacy of Trump with, I don't know what they've recorded, like 15,000 lies. I mean, it's both the fact that the President of the United States is an uninterrupted liar, and the fact that the United States lied about, to be fair to the Bush people, I don't think they thought they were lying, but they were pretty reckless. In other words, I think actually they believed their own propaganda. The first victim of propaganda is always the propagandist. And I think that was the case of the Bush people. So I don't think they were consciously lying. That's different from Trump. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter because I think the American people don't have confidence in these statements. I think it would be very hard to persuade the American people that this would be a basis for military action. And I think the world doesn't have confidence. I mean, this is a sign of just how much our standing in the world has declined.
What about Congress and the effect that the lobbying by the Israelis and the Saudis, it's been pretty effective on the Hill?
Well, I'm not sure how effective it is. And this might go to the last question about the presidential issues. Let me try and I'll come back to that. On what have I got? Okay, on the, sorry, you asked about the agenda.
Of the Saudis and the Israelis.
The last one over the yellow shirt.
No, I'm going to come. The question about the independent Kurdish state. No, I don't think that. First, I don't think there's going to be significant migration from Turkey into independent Kurdish state, and I don't think Turkish Kurds are looking to move to Iraqi Kurdistan, and I don't think Iraqi Kurdistan is looking to have them. They could move now. Mind you, if those of you who hold American passports or European passports, you want to go to Iraq to Baghdad, you got to get a visa. You want to take the MEA flight to Erbil? No visa required, because one of the other features of this of the way things work in Iraq is Kurdistan controls its own border and basically controls its own immigration. So if people wanted to come from Turkey into Iraqi Kurdistan, they could. But in fact, Iraqi Kurdistan is hiring guest workers from, just like the Gulf states. There are people from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Philippines and so on. And the other argument you hear as well, if they become independent, wouldn't they want to have, a greater Kurdistan? Well, no. Just because they're Kurdish doesn't mean they want to have a larger state. For one thing, it would mean if they were somehow to be able to unite with Turkey, there are 18 million Kurds in Turkey, there are maybe 4.5 million in Iraq, they would be ruled from Diyarbakir. And then of course they have some pretty substantial oil resources. There's no real desire to share that. And if you apply a European standard, Moldova didn't want to be part of Romania. Austria doesn't want to be part of Germany. Switzerland doesn't want to be part of Germany, although it's 80%. So, one should get away from that assumption. Now, finally, the upcoming presidential elections and politics. The first thing I would say politically on the Palestinian-Israeli issue is, at a certain point, the identification of the Israeli right with the right wing of the Republican Party has consequences. And you begin to see electoral consequences. The senator from my own state, Bernie Sanders, is basically a champion of the Palestinians. There are two Muslim women who've been much in the news, who were elected to Congress. So there is a significant majority of American Jews do not approve of Netanyahu, and 70% of American Jews vote Democratic. And they aren't voting Democratic on the basis of who is going to be moving the embassy to Jerusalem or annex the most territory. They're moving because they have a liberal mindset. And the Saudis, yes, they're lobbying, and their contracts, and if you have a big defense, somebody who makes an aircraft in your district, that can be a factor. But a lot of people are pretty turned off by what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen and by the murder of Khashoggi. So I don't know how that's going to turn out. How the upcoming presidential election is going to be? Well, first, I would say I'm going to give Obama some credit for what he did. First, he didn't get involved in the Syrian civil war. And to my mind, that was right. There's no point. First, there wasn't any side that looked like it could win. And I am totally opposed to policies that get involved in wars that can't be won, because the only consequence of that is that more people get killed. And secondly, and one of the reasons, well, there are lots of reasons why it didn't look like it was going to happen. They're also very hard to find people that you could count on to support. But when the chips were down, when the Yazidis were attacked in northern Iraq, and it was clearly genocide, as defined by the Genocide Convention, which is acts intended to kill a group in whole or in part. And there's no doubt that the Islamic State's actions against the Yazidis were intended to kill the group in whole or in part. The attack took place on a Sunday. Obama intervened militarily on Thursday. It's the fastest U.S. response. I think it's the fastest response of any government in history to genocide. Compare that to what happened in Rwanda in 1994, where the whole thing, the most rapid killing and even more rapid than the Holocaust, and nobody did anything. Or Bosnia, which I was very much involved in. And lobbying for intervention took 2.5 years. So, I'll give him credit for that. And then I'll give him credit, maybe the most remarkable thing, was when Kobani was under siege. Who were the people in Kobani? They were the PYD, Who's the PYD? They're basically the allies of the PKK. Turkey wasn't doing anything because, of course, they were very eager to see them wiped out. It was an incredible political decision. First, to lend your air force to somebody who's an ally of a group that's on your terrorism list, and then to drop arms to them. I mean, of course, the decision I totally support. So I think it does make a difference as to who is the president. I think one of the things you want to look at, and that's one. Two, I don't think Trump is going to have a second term. Well, you just have to look at, one always has to be careful in politics between what you wish to be true and what is true. But I will say this, which is, this is the only president in history who's never been a positive approval rating. So always more people have disapproved than have approved of him. Secondly, he trailed in the polling now, which of course doesn't say what it's going to be a year from now, but it's still significant. He trails Joe Biden by 15 points, Bernie Sanders, who's a socialist, by, I think, 11 points, Elizabeth Warren by 9 points, Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend that nobody's heard of, and who's a really bright and attractive guy and who has a husband. There's a part of America that's uncomfortable with that. He trails him by 4 points. If you want to look back, Obama's approval ratings a year before the 2012 elections weren't that great, but he led all his opponents, including Mitt Romney, by 6 points. So, I think there's and besides, Americans see the same thing that everybody else sees. I mean, the trade wars are hurting his base. The farmers are hurting. Buying Greenland. Calling the Nazi Party good people. I mean, there's a segment that supports him, but there's a pretty big segment that doesn't. Now, in terms of this part of the world, if it's going to be a Democrat, here's what I'll tell you to watch out for. If it's Joe Biden, you're going to see a continued level of engagement. Similar to Biden, to Obama. However, effectively, I think this is a two-person race between Biden and Elizabeth Warren. I don't think Bernie Sanders is going to get it. But even if you allow a three-person race, both Sanders and Warren are people who are saying they're fed up with the forever wars. And so I think that could see a U.S. disengagement from Iraq and from Syria. And so it could be quite a different policy. In all cases, human rights and other, those issues will be a higher priority. They'll all rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. They'll all, on day one, they'll rejoin the Paris Accords. So you'll see something more normal.
I think on that hopeful note, we'll wrap it up and say thank you for Ambassador Galbraith.